The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi everybody, welcome to the Lunch and Learn series. Welcome, I hope you've had a great week. We're looking at our last topic now, which is topic 6, and we're looking at a very interesting topic around culture change, basically. So I'm going to talk a little bit around how you can change the culture in your own organisation, in local government. And of course, these things take time, but I'm going to share with you a number of different models, some of my own experience working in local government and so forth. So let's get underway. Now, the normal process, if you've got questions or observations or comments, just go to the question box and type in your question. I get to see it immediately, which is good, and I will respond to it immediately as well. The other thing is, of course, you'll receive the slides and the recording as usual at the end of the topic. So, all right, let's now launch into our topic, and you can see, of course, a quick overview, and I won't go through each topic now, but a quick overview. You can see that we've covered 6 topics. You can see that there's lots of different things that we've looked at, and today, of course, we're looking at driving positive cultural change. Okay, so of course, the last time we met, we talked about conflict and negotiations, and I asked you to complete that conflict and that negotiation profile. And what that profile did was to show you your preferred way of dealing with conflict. And my point in the last unit, when we got together a couple of weeks ago, was simply this, that you need to use all 5 different approaches when you're dealing with conflict, and not just stick with the default approach that you feel most comfortable with. By doing that, of course, it means that in certain situations, or in all situations, you're likely to be more flexible. But the other thing, of course, about that is that regardless of who you're having conflict with or you're negotiating, and negotiation, incidentally, is a form of conflict, but regardless of who you're working with, if plan A doesn't work, then you can move to plan B or C or D or even E. So in other words, it's all about being flexible. And what I wanted you to do, of course, was to practice that in your day-to-day interaction with other people. And I hope you've had a chance to do that. Okay, so what are we covering today? Well, I'm going to look at my definition of culture. I think the word culture is used a lot. And if you Google the word culture, you just type the word culture, you'll come up with literally millions of definitions and insights and angles and dimensions. So I want to share with you what I think culture is. Then I want to talk about a concept called the ambidextrous organisation, which was a very famous article that was written by O'Reilly several years ago in the Harvard Business Review. And I just want to talk about that because it's got a lot of application for local government. And I want to talk about the emotional stages of change. I think most of us, when we're embarking on change, are often looking at processes and procedures and how we do things. But often the missing link is actually the way people think. And we do know, predictably, that people go through 4 emotional stages when they're confronted with change, whether it's positive change or negative change. We could look at some of the core values in the new organisation, which you should be trying to implement. And I'll finish up with a where to from here. And ultimately, that's where we go. So let's get underway. So here's my definition of culture. It's not the only definition, but just so you know where I'm going, this is my definition. A basic pattern of shared assumptions, values and beliefs considered to be the correct way of thinking and acting on problems and opportunities within an organisation or facing an organisation. So the key things there is a certain pattern of behaviours, and these patterns of behaviours are normally shared by people who work in the organisation. And of course, it's not just about what people do, it's also about what people think. And so it's both about thinking and doing, and it's also a consistent form of behaviour and thought pattern. So, of course, when you look at any organisation, if I came into your organisation tomorrow, I would see certain things that were very obvious, such as the uniforms that people wear, the meetings and how they're conducted, the way people address people, what issues are important, whether your organisation is reactive or proactive. All of these things, of course, are what we might call above the line. In other words, if you think about a big iceberg, there's a tip of the iceberg that's above the waterline, and of course, there's a whole chunk of the iceberg that's below the waterline. So the things that are above the waterline are very, very obvious. The things below, of course, take a little bit of time to decipher and to observe because you need to be there for a period of time. So a new employee in your organisation would pick up these things in the first few months that they work there. These would be the beliefs and the values and the assumptions that people hold that aren't clearly overt to other people. So the question might be, why do we have a culture? So what's the point of having a culture? Why is there such a notion as culture? Well, there's a whole range of reasons for that. It adds as a sense-making mechanism. In other words, we get some boundaries around what's appropriate and inappropriate behaviour. It gives us a sense of identity as an organisation. So if you look at local government in Queensland, for example, there's a pervading culture around local government. But if I went to your council, I would find a unique culture there that is also there, but of course is part of the local government fabric. The other thing, of course, is it adds a degree of stability so that people pretty much know what to expect. So you get any bunch of people anywhere in the world and you'll find a distinct culture, and that culture will be fairly obvious when you spend time with that group of people. And your organisation, of course, has a culture. The question then becomes, is it a culture that's working for you or not? And that's really the question I wanted to talk about from here on in. Now, one of the things that, and I'm going to share with you some tools that I think you can find quite interesting and useful in your own organisation. Now, there's a number of local government environments that I've worked in where I've used this approach, and you might be able to share this approach and use it in your own organisation. So basically, you ask your group of people 3 key questions, and you'll come up with some really interesting answers. And the 3 key questions are, if you had to describe this organisation as a colour, what colour would it be and why? If you had to describe this organisation as an animal, what animal would it be and why? And if you had to describe this organisation as a motor vehicle, what motor vehicle would it be and why? Now, this can be a very useful little strategy because it gives people a chance to think about a metaphor, if you like, for the organisational culture. And then once they've picked something such as a lion, they then decide, then they give you an explanation as to why. So this is something that's very useful that you could use in a meeting, and it literally takes 20 minutes, and you hear what people have got to say. And what you will find if you do this exercise is there'll be some common themes come up across the group. And those common themes, of course, won't surprise you because you've probably observed them as well. And those common themes are pretty much what the culture's like. So that's a great little metaphor to get people moving in that direction. So give that a shot. It's certainly it's a fun exercise. Of course, people come up with all sorts of colours and animals and vehicles, and it makes it very interesting when people share that with you. So that's one strategy you can use. It's not the only one, but it's a good strategy to start with. Now, what you could do is you could ask people these questions, and then, of course, you can then say to your team, and I've done this in other local government environments, so I say, okay, that's where we are now. Where do we need to be? And there'll often be a gap, of course, between what people describe as their culture right now and where they need to be. So then the question is, how do we go from A to B? How do we go from our current culture to our preferred culture? And there'll probably be, I'll give you an example without mentioning the local government I was working in. There was an issue around transparency that we get told only on a need-to-know basis, that we don't know, that managers often withhold information unless it's really relevant to the situation that we're in. And that's how they describe the current culture. It wouldn't surprise you that what they wanted, that group of people I work with, and they said, well, how do we create, what's the preferred culture? And they said a culture of transparency. So obviously then it's a question then of asking, how do we go from where we are to where we need to be? So that can be a very effective exercise that you can do in your organisations, and you'll find it works really well. There's one organisation where I've done this right across the whole organisation. Every single person was invited to a meeting and given an opportunity to address these three questions. And from that, we generated a report. We looked at the other things that perhaps the positive things that, the intended culture, and we said, right, you say we're here, we need to be there, how do we go from A to B? So that's a very useful strategy that you can certainly use. Now, this is a very busy slide that I'm going to put up right now, so don't be deterred. Of course, you get a chance to look at all these slides. But if you wanted to use a little bit more of a scientific method in this approach, you could actually look at the dimensions of organisational culture. And you can see on your screen there are 10 dimensions in yellow, and there's a little bit of an explanation as to what those dimensions really mean. But the important thing are those dimensions over on the left-hand side. And so now we've got a little bit of a train track to run on, and you could actually get people to rate these dimensions on a scale of 1 to 5. 5 is high, 1 is low. So for example, if we take one of these, let's talk about risk tolerance. So if we talk about risk tolerance, we could say, how risk tolerant are we in this organisation? So because it's a local government environment, it's probably likely not to have a high risk tolerance. Whereas if it was a startup IT firm or something, it's likely to have it's going to have a high risk tolerance. But for local government, you would hope that it'll be low risk tolerance. But the question is it too low? So you can get numbers around this that can be very, very effective. Gives you a sense of where people are thinking on a whole range of parameters. These are industry specific. So as I said before, if I went to an IT firm and I gave people those 10 dimensions, I would be expecting perhaps different results than I would be in a local government environment, and so would you. So it is industry specific, but nevertheless, it's another way of being able to get a handle on the organisation and where it stands. Okay, now I mentioned at the outset about this concept of the ambidextrous organisation. Now, ambidexterity, as we know, is, if we take the sporting analogy, for example, somebody could play equally effectively with their left hand versus their right hand. So for example, if you're a tennis player, if you're an ambidextrous tennis player, you can play right-handed or left-handed. So that's the sort of traditional understanding of what ambidexterity means. But what O'Reilly and Tushman were talking about in their article was to suggest that organisations should be ambidextrous as well. And what I mean by that is that on the one hand, the organisation needs to be compliant-driven, risk-averse, and so forth. So yes, you need to certainly be that, because you are, of course, a government environment. But on the other hand, you've got a need to be spontaneous, innovative, creative, continuously improving. Now, as you well know, local government is looking at itself as to how we can be a little bit more innovative, a little bit more creative, a little bit more. So we've got these tensions going on. And the argument in the article is that you can actually have both of those values embedded in your organisation. But in order to do that, you need to be very, very clear about where the line is between one or the other. So on the one hand, when do we have to be very risk averse? So for example, in safety and compliance, you would expect your organisation to be doing things by the book. So that would be one hand. But on the other hand, of course, somebody who might be a customer service officer would be bombarded, I would have thought, on a regular basis with a whole range of left field requests and interesting questions. And so often they've got to think on their feet as to how I might deal with that, or who I should put them through to. So there's a whole range of factors that go with that. So, creating those two is very, very important, because I think it's fair to say local government, on the one hand, is very compliant driven, but I think it's got a long, long way to go before it can start to think outside the box and so forth. So the good news, though, is that you can actually create an organisation that has both of those cultures in place. Now, one of the things I mentioned also at the outset was the notion that when people go through change, they actually go through 4 emotional stages. And this is very much based on the grief cycle. And it's pretty much true of all situations that these stages or emotions that we talk about are really they're real, and you as a leader have to deal with these. And I think my criticism is that there's a lot of material out there on change management, but very little material that's out there thinking about the emotional stages that people go through, except for one stage, which is resistance, and there's a lot of material out there on that. But let me just walk you through the model, because it's a very practical model and very useful. As a senior leader, when you make an announcement to your team, the first actual emotional stage that they're going to be in is denial. In other words, they're not going to really embrace what it is. So you might be suggesting to them that there'll be a new system in place on Monday, and that people need to get themselves organised because there'll be a new system and people are going to need to be trained and upgrade their skill set, so forth. The first reaction people are going to have is just straight over the top of the head. Nothing's going to change. It'll be the same. This is what happened, of course, during amalgamation. Many people were in denial for long periods of time before they realised it was real. So at that stage of denial, people are continuing to do what they've always done. So the productivity and morale is usually pretty high, but then it comes plummeting down when people start to resist the change. So people slip from denial to resistance, and of course we've all seen people resisting. I argue that people in organisations have what I would call professional resistors. That is, if you gave them free beer tomorrow, they'd be whinging that it's not cold. There's always something that's not right. So the resistance phase or emotion that people go through is very real, and it's something that has to be addressed by the leader. You can't bypass it. It is a natural, normal human emotion to actually resist something that's new, whether it's positive or negative, I might say. So that, of course, is where we tend to spend all of our energy trying to get people to overcome resistance. The bottom line is how you overcome resistance is actually to create forums where you can listen to people's concern in a non-judgmental way and allow them to get their resistance out. And so if you do that effectively, of course, you neutralize the resistance. But what happens, unfortunately, during that resistance phase is that productivity goes down. And you can see on the graph there that productivity is plummeting, and you don't want people to be in that phase for too long. So the next phase, of course, is exploration. Now, exploration is where people are starting to come to terms with the change. In other words, they know it's real, they have had their complaint about it, and they have to start trying to work out how to make it work for them. So what happens is the productivity starts to increase as people explore the new change and what it means for them and how they're going to react to it. So, if you look at, let's get back to that amalgamation. Initially there was denial, and then of course there was a whole bunch of resistance about why we're doing this, and because we're amalgamating a whole bunch of councils in virtual areas, we are going to take away that personalised approach to the community. So there's a lot of resistance, as you know. And then during exploration, of course, every council was trying to work out how to make it work. How are we going to actually amalgamate these 3 or 4 councils so that they can work more effectively together? And then the final phase of change is commitment. Ultimately, what happens is that after a period of time when people are used to the change, they're often committed to the change. So in other words, if you went about changing something at that stage, people would probably defend the change and say it's a good thing. Whereas previously what they were saying is it was a terrible thing, because their emotional state is in that state of commitment rather than in resistance. And of course, at that stage, productivity is high and things are going extremely well. And so those things are very, very useful. So let me give you a couple of key examples, if I may, that might assist you to understand this model a bit better. I'm going to talk about a positive change, and I'm going to talk about a negative change. And I'm going to talk about the positive change of winning lotto. Now, I'm sure we're all, maybe you've been lucky enough to win it. I certainly haven't, but we're all hopeful at least. Now, if somebody rang you now, and you had your mobile phone there, and all of a sudden the phone rang, and you picked it up and they said, congratulations, you've just won $20 million. Now, your first reaction would be what? Now, you might think it would be celebration, but it wouldn't be. Your first reaction would be, who's this? Is this a wind-up? You wouldn't believe the information that's being conveyed to you via the telephone. So you're actually in denial for a period of time, perhaps not for too long once you find out it's real, but you're certainly going to be in that stage initially. Now, you're not going to resist winning lotto, but you're obviously going to start to think for yourself for a minute, and you're going to have a little bit of what psychologists call cognitive dissonance. So you're going to start thinking to yourself, well, hang on a minute, $20 million is going to change my life. I need to think carefully about how I manage this. How am I going to spend the money? And am I going to tell people? I'm not going to tell people. So you're going to go through that kind of process of thinking it through. The third reaction that you're going to have in all of this is, of course, exploration, which is around making lists of how you're going to spend the money. You're going to perhaps, drop into a car yard spontaneously. You might do all sorts of things that you can check out and explore. So you're going to be in that exploration stage. And of course, you're going to be in a committed stage fairly quickly because you've won $20 million. And that's a great thing. And you're all going to be very happy about that and celebrate. But you can see even in a positive change like that, you will still go through those 4 stages. Now let's take a not so positive point of view. Let's imagine that you're at home in the evening and it's pouring rain and there's a knock at the door, and you open the door and there's a police officer there, and the police officer says that one of your children perhaps has been injured in a car accident. They're okay, but they're in hospital. Now, your first reaction is going to be one of disbelief, and you're going to actually say things, or at least you're going to think things like, is this real? Have you got the right house? Are you sure? You're going to think like that, aren't you? Now, very quickly, of course, you're going to be in a stage, you're going to slip into resistance. You're going to start to blame council for not filling in all the potholes. You might blame the police for being on the other side of town, revenue raising when they should have been over in that area enforcing the law. Everyone's to blame for that particular situation. And then you get to exploration where perhaps the door closes and you and your partner look at each other and say, well, look, we just have to do things one step at a time. Let's do one thing at a time. We can only deal with what's in front of us. And of course, you get to the hospital and so forth. So you're in that exploration stage. And surprisingly enough, it might be 20 years later, but you might be sitting on the balcony with your partner and you basically discuss what happened 20 years ago. And one of you might say to the other one, you know what happened 20 years ago was terrible, but one thing it did is it brought us closer together. So there's kind of like a silver lining to the cloud. So you can see that in both cases, whether it's lotto or that sort of situation, you actually go through those 4 stages. So you can use this framework very effectively to start to plan how you might deal with change. So in denial, people want information. They don't want to be convinced about it because they don't know enough about it to be convinced. But what they do want is facts and figures and information. So they want to know how this change is going to impact on them personally. In resistance, what people simply want is to be listened to with respect. So you need to create an environment where that can occur. And it's not necessarily a pleasant thing because a lot of people will be quite upset and they'll be airing that at the meeting. But unless you do that in a forum like that, it's likely they're going to do it at the water cooler, or they're going to undermine people, and so forth. And that's not necessarily a good thing. Let me give you an example what I mean by that. Let's say, for example, that you have made an announcement to your team. You've said, this is what's happening on Monday. There's a new computer system, blah, blah, blah. And then you say to them, are there any questions about the change? And there's absolute silence. And you actually walk away thinking, well, that's great. No resistance. How wonderful. And then you walk outside, and at the water cooler there, two of the people that were there are whinging about the change. And you pull up one of them and say, look, you had a chance to talk in the meeting and you didn't. So, I'd appreciate that you raise these matters in the right place. But of course, the managers made the mistake because after the meeting, and with a little bit of time, what's happened is that the people that were in the meeting have slipped into that second emotional stage, which is resistance. Now, what would be a better approach would be to make an announcement and then to let the team digest that and suggest to the team that you'll get back together with them again in a week, and you're going to ask them to bring their concerns and questions to that meeting. Now, that's a good thing to do because by that stage, you've managed the resistance so that when people come back to the meeting, they've got some real concerns that they want to share with you, and you're doing it in a fairly controlled environment. All right, so, exploration, what people need there is your support, training, coaching, all of those things. So that means that you as a senior leader have to be out and about more than you would normally be out and about. And then when you get to the stage of commitment, that's where, of course, there are lessons learned from the change. This is not a time to just become complacent. It's an opportunity for you to sit down with your team and to talk about what's worked well and perhaps what hasn't worked well. So this is a great model. It's one of my favorite models, and it really does provide people with some an excellent framework to understand human nature and how it likes to operate. Where a lot of managers make a big mistake is that when people make that transition from resistance to exploration, and they do migrate, there are, as I said, some people that are often called professional resistors that will complain about anything. And in those sorts of situations, of course, excuse me, I've just got to, in those sorts of situations, that becomes problematic because in those sort of situations, they, I've forgotten my train of thought, in the resistance. So some people are now exploring it, so they're going into exploration, and these other people are staying back. Now, one of the things, little analogy I'd use for you is that often what happens is that if you can imagine that you're in a bus, you're in the driver's seat, and you've got the bus, the bus has started, and you've got all your reluctant team members on board. In other words, you're going into a change, you're going to a destination. And in the bus shelter, you've got two people who are resistant. They're quite, they've decided they don't want to come on board. So what the big mistake a lot of managers make is that they turn the engine of the car off, implying, of course, that the change is negotiable. And they go and talk to the people, and they spend maybe 30 minutes, 40 minutes, an hour, hour and a half, and try to convert them that it's really in their best interest to get on the bus. And of course, this is problematic because the people that are on the bus are your supporters. They're the ones that want to move on to the destination, whereas you're spending all the time with the professional resistors. So that's not a good idea. So how do you deal with that? Well, you notice two people in the bus shelter, you've got people on board, you turn the engine, you do not turn the engine off, you keep it on. In other words, the implication is that we're going to be moving soon. You get off the bus, you go to the bus shelter, and you say to the two professional resistors, guys, girls, whoever it is, share with me what your concerns are. You've got 20 minutes because we're about to leave, and out of sheer courtesy, I'm willing to give you, an opportunity to share your view and listen to what they have to say. And then you simply say, well, we're about to move. What are you going to do? So you put the accountability back on the people that are resisting, not the other way around. So the simplest way of me explaining that is be hard on the change. In other words, the change is non-negotiable. We are going to do whatever we're going to do or decided to do, but be soft on the people, as in empathizing and understanding their position, but not spending too much time wallowing around in people's resistance, because as I said, you're going to find yourself wasting a lot of time. The other problem, of course, with that is that people that are on the bus already reluctantly may choose to get off the bus because it's going nowhere. So the energy should be with those who have made that transition to the exploration stage, and not the energy with the people who are holding back. It's normally the minority. That's not where you should spend all of your energy. Okay, so that's the change model. Now, again, I've got a very busy slide here. Then you can certainly look at this at another stage, but I don't want to run through this laboriously with you, but I simply wanted to point out that there are some values that are really important in the new organisation, and you'll find that younger people coming into local government probably more likely will embrace these values than people who have perhaps been working in the environment for a long period of time. So if you look at the column there that says shared values, you'll notice that we've got flexible deployment. What does that basically mean in a nutshell? Well, flexible deployment simply means that people are multitasked. I find in local government it's too specialised, that people are inflexible, and sometimes we go out and get contract labour when we could actually be utilising and harnessing people who are working in other areas if they knew how to do what they needed to do. So flexible deployment simply means is giving people an opportunity to learn a range of skills in their organisation which they can apply when needed in different situations. You've got customer focus. So everything we say, think and do ultimately should be in the interests of our public. But of course, the old thinking is internal focus. That is, let's make sure that we dot I's and cross T's. Now, yes, we do need to be, compliant, as I said, and regulatory, of course, and we expect that. But we've also got to be aware that ultimately we're there for the public. We're there for the community. So therefore, there needs to be a strong emphasis on a focus on the customer rather than a focus on the internal. We've got performance focus instead of job focus. What I mean by that is that we should be looking at performance, not just do people tick the box and do what's on their job description. There's a lot more to it than that. So performance focus is getting things done. There needs to be a focus on project-based work rather than functional-based work. And local government, as we've talked about previously, is very much a hierarchical environment, very much a functional-based environment where you have a whole series of hierarchies. But ultimately, most things that happen in local government are actually going through a series of different departments. And so we've got to start thinking more project-based rather than hierarchical. And I've talked about that previously in one of our topics. We also want people to be engaged in the work they do. So human spirit and work is basically another term for engagement rather than disengagement. So how do we get people engaged in the work they do is the key question. And then we want people who are committed. So I know in many parts of Queensland it's very hard, of course, in fact almost impossible, to get qualified people to do certain jobs inside council. But what we've got to do is to make sure that regardless of how long somebody does decide to work in our environment, that they are committed to what we want them to achieve. We don't necessarily want people to be loyal, because loyalty has its own problems. If you're loyal to an organisation, you're likely to uphold some of the negative things it does, and so therefore you don't have an open mind about change. We actually want people who are committed rather than loyal, and they both mean different things. So if you've done a course at TAFE or university or something like that, you are probably quite committed to get through, right? You have to be. But it doesn't necessarily mean that you're loyal to the institution that gave you the piece of paper. All right, so commitment and loyalty are different things. Learning and development, we want people to continually grow and develop. Because if they don't grow and develop, of course, you're going backwards. Rather than training people, we want people to grow and develop and learn and develop. So it's a broader concept than just training. And of course, we want to create environments that are open. So we don't want closed environments. You'll get told on a need-to-know basis, and any news is good news. These sort of sayings no longer have any application in local government, or anywhere for that matter. And so we've got to stop those things and start sharing with people perspectives and information. I understand there are certain things that can't be shared, and that's fair enough. But let's not kid ourselves that the majority of things that happen in local government can be shared and should be shared. Why? Because we want people, regardless of where they are in the organisation, to think like us. So in other words, we want them to have the same perspective that we have. And so it's really, really important that we give people a chance to understand what's going on. Two things they need to know: what's going on in their job, which is of course feedback, and the other thing they need to know is where the organisation's heading, what's council's direction, what are we trying to achieve. So people need that information and they need to understand what's going on. So I'll give you a chance to digest that later. I don't want to go through all of that, which is in the front of your screen, other than to say to you that there are 8 shared values. When I say shared, they're shared between you and your team. And what you're trying to do is to create a culture that embraces those 8 values. And that is the key, I think, in all of this. All right, so let's move on. So the question then would be, okay, you've explained all that to me. Where do I start? How do I start to change the culture of my organisation? Now, I'm going to share with you one approach, but it's not the only approach, but it's one approach that you might like to consider, and it's certainly been implemented in local government quite successfully in some organisations. So let me draw it out for you and show you how you might consider this. And please feel free to ask me any questions that you have. The first thing we're going to do is that we are going to survey our organisation. But before we do that, we're going to create a replica of the organisation. And what I mean by that is we're going to create a small group of people who will come together in a project team to look at the ways of managing this project. So for example, if we've got a group of 8 to 12, you won't want any more than that, people, we need to make sure that they're fairly representative of the organisation as a whole. So of course, if we've got a representation of the organisation, there's not going to be many senior managers on that group. There's probably likely to be a few middle managers, and there's likely to be a lot of workforce. So that's the first obvious thing. And then when it comes to functions and departments, we're likely to want to make sure that all of the functions and departments are represented in this. So ultimately you get yourself a little replica of the organisation, which is a small project-based team. That does take a little bit of thinking, and you don't want people sitting there that don't want to be there either. So you're looking for people that actually want to be engaged in this project. That's step 1. All right, so this project team is going to take your organisation where you need it to go. Now, step 2 is that we're going to administer the survey. And what I mean by that is, in my case, when you looked at those 8 values before, I've designed a survey that actually has 10 questions for each of those 8 values. And so it's an 80 statements that go out via email. All of it's anonymous. No one knows who said what because everyone gets a unique key. And then once they've completed the survey, step 3 is that obviously we get a report. We get we can start to crunch the numbers and have a look. I might say that the survey is designed where we have top management, middle management, and workforce as 3 different perspectives or dimensions. So we will now look at the results. And what we do is that we get our project team together. Remember, this is step 1. We get that team together and we give them a copy of that report. And what we're going to ask them to do is to analyse the results. And the 3 questions they're going to ask is, first of all, is this an accurate description of how the organisation operates, is question 1. Question 2 is, can you give some illustrations from your own perspective of that in action? And question 3 is, what can we do in order to change that or maintain it, if of course it's good? So this whole project team is going to create a second report, and that second report is around the change that's going to take place. But if you get the right people in the room on that project team, then clearly they're going to make a good job of this, because they're representative of the views, ultimately, not perfectly, but generally, they're going to be representative of the views of the organisation. Okay, so step 4. Step 4 is we, you know, as I said before, we'll form the project team, and normally we'll get the team together for a couple of days. The project team, we want people, as I said, to want to be there, so we handpick those people. And then what we do, next step 5, is that we give them some team development, because obviously these people haven't normally worked together closely, certainly not in this type of project. So we want to give them a bit of team development. So the project is, you know, we give them some of the sort of teamwork type typical stuff that we normally would give a new team. So that's first day. Second day is that we do all the number crunching, and we go through the report and respond to those 3 questions that I raised with you earlier. And then step 4, as I said, step 6 is to develop some strategies that will ultimately move the organisation from where it is now to where we want it to be. And then step 7 is that we start implementing those strategies. But before we implement those, usually what would occur there is that this project team would present their findings to the executive team. So you would be engaged at that end where we're using a bottom-up approach. So they would come to that meeting, they would suggest that this needs to change, this and that, and this is how it'll change, this is why it needs to change, and so forth and so on. So ultimately, the executive team will then make a decision about what the priorities are in that report, because there'll be a lot of information. Not all of that information may be relevant, so there'll be a lot of information, and then you know, people will make up their mind how they deal with it. And of course, step 8, the final step in the process, and this is why it's cyclical, step 8 is really, again, to go through the survey result again. So we survey people again, and what we're looking for is a before and after snapshot. What we're trying to determine is, have we made progress towards the new culture? So folks, that's one way of doing it. There are other ways of doing it, but that's a way that I can share with you, where if you're wondering, where do I start? Well, that's not a bad place to go. Okay, now your homework. Your homework basically is to take away one of the templates that we've shared with you, whether it's the animal, the color of the vehicle, or whether it's, you know, whether it's the ambidextrous organization, or whether it's the 4 emotional stages of change, whatever it might be, and start to implement it in your own working environment. And start somewhere, and start to make a deliberate effort to change the culture for a better working culture. Now, if you do that, you're in the right, you're certainly off to a good start. But don't assume that culture can't be changed. It can be. I'm not suggesting it'll happen overnight, but it does happen, and it can be quite profound and make a huge difference. So folks, that's your homework. I just wanted to say thank you for being involved in the Lunch and Learn series. I've really appreciated working with you. I've got another one coming up on the 28th of this month. So if you've got teams, if you've got people in your organisation who you would like, and it won't be the same information, of course, it'll be more pitched at team leader level. If you've got people who you would like to put through this process, just send me a line, send me an email, and I'm more than happy to get that organised for you. It won't be, it's not a costly exercise, same cost as what you've paid for this as well. All right, so one last thing, a little plug before I finish up, if I may. I've got my latest book coming out later this year called Winning Teams, Applying the All Blacks Formula to Your Team. You can see the cover of the book there. It's not published yet, but it will be. But if you want to order that, in other words, pre-order it, send me an email. It'll cost you $30, and in order to give you that, I will also give you a free admission to another Lunch and Learn program. All right, so that'll be I'll be giving you an opportunity to involve yourself in that. Just send me an email and I will be more than happy to work with you to organise that. So thanks everyone. I'm pretty much done, and we're very quiet today, not too many questions, so that's okay. Thank you for your involvement in the process. I've really enjoyed working with you. Hope you've got something useful out of it, and have a fantastic weekend, and hopefully we'll hear from you at some point. So thank you and all the best and goodbye.